12 geometric notation. I think all of this you know, but I just want to make sure that you recognize the notation. So if we have, and I'm going to write the word because we want to talk about the symbol. If we have parallel lines slash segments. Now remember, a segment is a part of a line. Is it a piece? Is it going on forever? And so you'll want to look, you have to take it in context. Is it a segment in the picture? Is it a segment? Is it a line? Parallel line segments, remember the symbol looks like that. Remember, you write lines with a line above it. You write segments with a little segment above it. And I normally don't put that there, but I will go ahead and put that there. Okay. Now, what about congruent anything? Now, you can't have congruent lines. Lines can't be measured, so they can't be congruent. Because what does congruent mean?
They have the same measure.
They have the same measure. So we can have congruent angles. We can also have congruent segments. And do you remember the symbol? We haven't used it a lot. It's an equals with a little squiggle above it. Okay, do we know the symbol for a right angle, which is also called, do you know this word, perpendicular? We haven't defined it, but sometimes I use it, so I want to make sure. Perpendicular just simply means two segments, lines that intersect at a right angle. And I think we've used this one, haven't we? The little upside down T. Have we used that for perpendicular right angle? Okay, that shows that you're forming a right angle, okay? That's what I needed to know, had we used that one. Now, I kind of swap them back and forth because I put this one here and we're going to write the stuff about it over here. Now, there's three things. You want to be able to look at a picture and tell me what you see. Let's start with the one, well, I don't know that any of these, now remember the right angle shows up like this, and then this is the symbol we use. So why don't we start with that one? If I'm going to talk about, okay, I think I chopped a letter off on this one when I cut and pasted it. Yeah, there's a W right here. Let's say, I can't name that segment because it doesn't have a segment on it. So when I see this, it's a right angle. What we're going to say is that this segment, which is real easy, WS is a segment, is perpendicular, is a right angle, I guess, because I always say perpendicular, but that's the word for it. Now, this is a segment. Now, I can say it three different, well, I say three, and maybe more than ways than that. I could call this UR. You agree with that? I could call it SR, or I could call it US, because all of this is perpendicular to that. I'm just going to use the big one. Now you see these little symbols. Have I mentioned these? Do you know, you think you know what they mean? I think we've used them just a little bit. Do you know what that means? That means they're congruent, and I'll do this. So that means those are the same, if I can spell congruent, I can't talk and spell at the same time. Congruent segments. See, that's a segment. So that means segment VU, see? That segment is congruent to this segment. So you're kind of interpreting. Now, have we done this one? I don't think we've done, maybe not. This one is also congruent angles, congruent. So I'm going to draw and say also congruent. So with angles, it's going to have these little arc things in the angle. And so now let's talk about a name for that angle. Could I call that angle angle U? Can I? Is it the only angle there? Can I call it angle U? Yes. You see that? We talked about naming angles. It's been a while. One of the very first things when we did angles. Let's see, where did we name angles? Right here. An angle is two rays. We can call it RST. We can call it, am I on screen? Yeah. TSR, we can call it angle 1. I don't think any of these are numbered today. Or we can call it angle S because there's only one angle there. Now remember, when you have one like this, you can't call it angle B, and I think we'll run into that. Now, I would take the easiest route. Now, can I call it VU? What did I write over right here? Is that a letter? That was a S right there. Could I call it angle VUS? Yes. Could I call it angle VUR? Yes. So it's got a lot of names. And then obviously SUV. But to me, the easiest is the angle U. If you can call it by its vertex, is congruent to angle R. Okay, we'll call this one number 1. We put its work over here. Number 2. Well, do you see the 3 things that I have? There's 3 things in every picture. I see something congruent. Now, we'll have to talk about what's congruent in that picture. I see, what are these? What does that mean? What is parallel? See, there's your little arrows that mean parallel. And then that means a right angular. A right angle. There's your little perpendicular. And we got to decide how we want to call that. Now, in this case, let's do the parallel first, because I think that's probably the easiest. What is this? That is a line, and that's a line. Now, I always run into somebody that said they call it segment FE and segment DC. Are those parallel too? Yes. So it's not wrong to call a segment, but in this case, you could say the segments are parallel, or I'm just going to say line FE. Oh, let me get over. Is parallel to line DC. I'm just going to call them as they are. Now let's do congruent. Now, lines can't be congruent, so it cannot be line FD and line EC are congruent. But what do you think they're talking about is congruent there? See these? It's not angles, it can be segments. What segments you think they're talking about? F to D and E to C. So segment FD, so how you write that is important, is congruent to segment EC. Let's talk about that right angle right there. Now, what is perpendicular? Could I name them segments? Yes. Could I name them lines? Yes. I'm going to use the lines just because they are the big lines. So what 2 lines are perpendicular? Segment F, line FD, or segment FD is perpendicular to segment or line DC. Technically, when you look at this thing right here, it's a ray, isn't it? It starts at U and it goes that way. And we haven't written a lot with rays. But can it be a segment? Yes. And I'll actually write it as a ray for you too, so you'll know. Now this one is a line or a segment. Now let's see the 3 things. I see perpendicular. You see that? I see congruent segments. And I see congruent angles. Let's do the angles first, because those are a little tricky. Can I call that angle V? Need to be careful. How many angles do I see at V? I see a bunch of them. I see this angle over here. So remember, when you have more than one, you've actually got a linear pair there. So there is not, when you say V, I'm saying, are you talking about that angle out here? And we may have some that have the angle on the outside. So you have to be careful. It's not just, so in this case, I can't call it V. So I have to call it angle WVU or UVW. I'm going to say WV is congruent. Now, how do we want to name this one? We can't call it W. If they had chopped this part off right here, if they had chopped it off right there, like they did over at number 1 with that little corner there, I could call it angle W. So that's the tricky part. Because if you put angle W on like your classwork, I'll just put a question mark there. Are you wrong? Yes, but not wrong for an X, you know, that type of thing. So what do we need to call it? You got to have the W in the middle, so I can call it, say it, go in, somebody start with V, VWU, I think that's excellent, or UWV. The segment's probably the easiest one in this case. What are the 2 segments that are the same length? WU segment is congruent to VU segment. Now this one's pretty obvious, and you could call it segment WU or you can call it line WU. I don't really care on that one. So I'm going to put W2U line. Now let's talk about, not congruent, perpendicular, to what we want to call this thing. Now, if you want the easy route, you could call it segment VU and be through with it, VU or UV. But I could also call it ray now, and I don't know that we've ever talked about ray so much, the way you write it as opposed to the way it looks. You always put the vertex first, and then you put a letter on the ray, which would be V, but no matter which way it's going, you would draw your little ray to the right. So this does not necessarily tell you what it looks like. This is just how you name it. You name the vertex first, you name the second letter, and then you put and it always goes to the right, no matter what it looks like here. So if you want to use a ray, that's how you would write it. Lesson number 4. Okay, now what do you have in this one? All I see are congruent things. Do you? We haven't seen this one yet. I see some congruent segments, and then I see a bunch of yucky stuff going on in here. Let's get the segments first. So segment ED is congruent to what's the other one? Segment DC or CD, either way. Now, when you have more than one set of congruent angles, like they do one little arc here and one little arc here. In this one, because you have more angles, you got to look for the number of arcs. Look at the little arcs drawn in here. There's 2 on that one, and there's 2 on this one. So these 2, this one is congruent to this one. We can't call them angle A because there's a bunch of angles at angle A. So I'm going to call that one angle EAF is congruent to angle BAC. You got to look for the number of little arcs on it. See, little curves there. And then this one has 3, and this one has 3. So that one's angle EAD, and this one is angle DAC. They've changed something here. So they're given, remember that notation of lines, QRS. And then I see some angles that are congruent. I see a right angle here, and I see parallel lines. You want to do it first? Now, what's the name of this line? I can call it line FE or line Q. Q is parallel to which other one? Look at your arrows, line R. You could have called it DC. See? So it's got a couple of different names. Now line S, if we use it, doesn't have another name because it's only got one letter on it. So you would have had to have another point if you're going to use this one, which we're fixing to use. What's perpendicular right here? That's a segment, isn't it? CB is perpendicular. And what's the only name I can call that? Line S. And you can write line S if you want to. I'm just going to put it S, and I'm going to put it cursive. If you make it a S, just make it a little s so it doesn't look like a point. I'm going to make it cursive. It's easy, except you can't call it angle E and angle D because there's a bunch of angles there. So I'm going to call that one angle FED, congruent to angle EDC.